So yeah, welcome everybody to the Good Decisions webinar. We're going to do an end of year recap on AI governance insights, insights that we've kind of collected from talking to our customers, the market, analysts, kind of bundle them all up in here for Dave Trier to take you through. And then we're going to talk about trends and goals for 2025. So a lot to cover in here, and let me just go to the next slide. Here's the agenda. Actually, before I do that, real quick, I do want to, just remind folks, if you're liking these insights, I know we've done 10 of these webinars throughout the year here. If you enjoy these, you're getting value from the webinars, please follow ModelOp on LinkedIn. It's the gift that's going to keep on giving all year long. All right, now we can get into the agenda. So we're going to do basically three things. We're going to start with the key insights from 2024. A lot of good insights there that we've collected. We'll jump into the trends and goals for 2025, kind of give you our opinion on where the market's going and what's going to be a priority for enterprises 2025. And then we'll talk about the implications and key takeaways. And with that, Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining, especially in the later part of December here. Hopefully everybody's gearing up for a nice holiday rest and relaxation. But really excited to talk a little bit about what we saw in 2024 as it relates to AI governance overall. And in general, as you see the tagline here, 2024 was actually the year of generative AI pilots and exploration. But we're going to talk through some of the statistics around these, what we're seeing from our customer base and in the market in general, both not only what the pilots and explorations look like on the business and demand side, but some of the headwinds that we also saw as it relates to the usage of AI. So if you go to the first slide, again, with that theme of 2024 being the year of pilots and exploration, some of the interesting stats that we saw was that in general, there was a lot of investment in generative AI, especially. As you can see on that bottom left-hand side, Accenture reported several $billion worth of revenue just related to AI revenue. But what the interesting stat about that is that a good majority of that were related to helping to develop generative AI pilots, POCs, exploration, right? So it's still in 2024, as much of the hype around generative AI and AI as a whole, it still was a bit of an early days in terms of where it is in the life cycle or maturity overall in the usage of this generative AI. Now, if you go back to the next slide, if you will, this actually further comes through with a recent study by Battery Ventures that talked about at the outset of 2024, we had these lofty expectations, right? Of here's what the plan is for generative AI, that we're going to start to use it quite substantially. But the actual usage was quite off from the expectations, about a 42% gap between what was expected at the outset of 2024 versus what actually occurred in usage by the business for these AI systems. So again, we're all part of the AI story, right? We're really fully ingrained in it. But what we saw in reality over 2024 is still lots of early experimentation, lots of early pilots, and the actual business or production usage was a little bit off from expectations. Now, if you double click on what actually made it there, if you go to the next one, what actually was used by the business was that a lot of these organizations, while there's lots of talk about developing your own generative AI systems, RAG architecture, infrastructure, everything related to it. But in reality, what we saw is you see some statistics from KPMG here was that about half of them, even a little bit more, were actually from vendors, right? Vendor solutions, vendor software that has AI embedded. And the actual in-house solutions in 2024 was not as substantial as some may think. So again, just a little bit of some of the actual data and facts that we've seen in practice in 2024. We're mainly focusing on the large enterprise, to be quite clear, but it is telling to know that, yeah, there's a lot of investment and at least talk about developing your own, when in fact there's really a good mix and a lot of them coming from the external vendors. Now, we couple that, if you head into the next slide, we couple that, again, a lot of experiments, pilots, presentations, but overall, we also saw that there was the regulatory landscape came into play in 2024. We all heard about the EU AI Act, quite substantial, one of the most substantial pieces of legislation as it relates to the use of AI as a whole. But if we target, and specifically what I'm calling out here is within the US, it was really the states that were leading the charge. Yes, there was Biden's executive order, there was the OMB's 24-10, but it was actually the states that were actually putting forward, hey, here is how we're going to enact or help to hold accountability and responsibility for these organizations in their use of AI. Colorado being one that I would call out that really took a charge, especially that's really impacting the insurance agency. But you can see a full list on the right-hand side of other states that have started to enable or enact some of these regulations. We will send some of this as a follow-up for those that are interested. I'm not going to cover that all today. But if you go to the next one, if you take a look at it from a vertical specific, sector specific lens, you'll see that, well, banking has always had model management and model governance. That was all the way back from a couple decades ago with the Department of Treasury's OCC SR 11.7 overall. So they've had some of that regulation in place. But other industries such as insurance, as I just mentioned with the Colorado AI Act, as I call it for short, or even in Canada, the OSFI E23 AI extensions, those are just examples of other industries that are, again, paving the way a little bit for how to lay out or what those regulatory landscapes will look like. And again, we'll send all of these. You can see the links on the right-hand side. We're happy to send you this as a follow-up, but just a nice breakdown of how in 2024 it shaped up, mainly state-led at the US level, but also a breakdown from the vertical lens as well. So in addition to these regulations, or as part of these regulations, there's quite a few of them, right? The EU AI Act, state level ones, right? Some of the federal level ones. They vary in various form factors, but there's generally 5 key themes that we see pervasive throughout these regulations. And those are, as you can see on the right-hand side, just making sure that you have visibility and inventory, if you will, of all the different areas that AI is being used across the organization. What the usage is, what's the intended usage, what are the users, what's the scope, the limitations, what data is involved, what are the impacting systems, and what are the potential ethical considerations that we need to keep in mind. The second is having the right controls in place, right? We want to use AI, right, for the good of the organization, but there are risks that are inherent to these AI systems. So what are the controls that we're putting in place to help to mitigate those risks, process change, access controls, etc. Third is very comprehensive testing, in particularly sometimes independent reviews or validations. And these are just making sure that the system, while we all design it to be perfect and to do exactly what we intended, things will go wrong. So how are we going to test that these are actually robust, that they're ethically fair, that they're stable, and they're driving the outcomes that we expect? And then fourth is that ongoing reviews. It's not just the upfront testing, but is this actually working as we intended? Where is it starting to deviate from it? Where is it starting to hit some of those risks that we had identified as part of it? And what are we doing to make sure we're mitigating those risks in production? And that leads to the fifth item, which is just inherent in everything, is just having the proper risk management capability in place so that you know for all these AI systems, here's the risks that have been identified. And again, here's how we're actually mitigating those risks overall. So those are just some of the regulatory. Now, if we talk about some of the headwinds, if you will, some of the challenges that we saw in 2024 with our customers and others, the first is actually kind of a fundamental problem, which was an accountability challenge. So if you think about AI, there's lots of talk about it, but what we saw was that there was a kind of a sporadic or differing views as to who is really accountable for AI governance within a large organization. On the right-hand side, you see this statistic from Forrester that talks about, well, some organizations, it was the chief data officers. Some it was the chief analytics officer. Some they had a chief ethical officer, if you will. Some had identified a governance leader. So it was really varied depending on the organization, which obviously if there's not one person accountable or one organization that's accountable, it makes it very challenging to drive some consistent and enforceable AI governance practices. Now, on the good side, though, we are seeing that there are, as you can see on the left-hand side, 3x the number of AI positions that have been hired over the past 5 years. And in particular, we're seeing the rise of the chief AI officer. I'm not endorsing that or saying that that's the right solution by any way, shape, or form. But when we see that chief AI officer, it does imply that that person is accountable for all that AI is being used in the organization, that they are accountable for the outcomes and helping to govern and oversee the use of AI across the organization. So we're going to continue to watch this in 2025. Again, not endorsing one form or the other, but we are recommending that there is one leader that is accountable for AI governance across the organization, whatever that title may be. Now, if we go to the next one, another headwind or challenge that we saw in 2024 is that these organizations were thinking, you know what, I can just build this myself. I can duct tape and Band-Aid together some existing systems, a lot of manual approaches that are being used, and that will be good enough for what we're doing. What we found, though, is as you see on the left-hand side, there was a lot that wasn't thought about, that not only that it was financially not very cost effective to build your own system. What was often missed was it wasn't just the upfront one-time build, but what's the ongoing maintenance cost to continue to iterate on this, to be able to account for all the different new technologies, internally developed, cloud-based, proprietary, external vendors. So being able to account for all those different types of technologies that are going to vary and grow exponentially over time, account for that maintenance cost of those types of scenarios. But there are also indirect costs that often weren't thought of. A lot of times they came down to, well, we actually aren't subject matter experts in terms of AI governance, so we're having to hire a lot of resources that are external professional services to help us along the way. We may also need to have a whole organization that's just being built around AI governance, which is kind of diverting us from our core competency that we're trying to do, whether that be a product company or a technology or a healthcare provider. But the big one I want to highlight is that bullet number 3, which is when trying to build your own, oftentimes it was a very manual process. Lots of manual checkpoints, manual go back and forth between different teams, trying to understand, well, I need to do this review. How do I go? Who is the right person for that? And that slows down the innovation cycle. So what we saw, even for those what could potentially be a smaller amount of pilots that made it in production, they were slowed down by those manual processes. So again, just something to keep in mind as we saw in practice in 2024, this build it yourself or this manual approach has some major implications, both financially as well as indirect overall. All right, so that was 2024. Again, lots of pilots, lots of experiments, some made it to production, a good mix, but mainly kind of vendor-based overall. A couple of the challenges we talked about. What we're seeing and what our projections are for 2025 is that 2024 was a year of experiment. 2025 is the year of realizing AI value. That, again, lots of investment around, especially generative AI. Now we're having to, these organizations are going to have to show what's the benefit, what's the value that's being driven, and they're going to be held accountable for that. So if you go to the next slide here, this was an interesting article that was published around from the CFO, that 78% of business leaders expect an ROI around generative AI in the next 1 to 3 years. So this isn't like a 5 to 10 year forecast of, all right, we put this into place, we'll start to reap the benefits in 5 to 10 years, but rather because of the significant opportunity, but also the significant cost around AI, that it is expected that you start to show these results very quickly, as you see in the top 1 to 3 years. But on the right-hand side was an interesting article in CIO.com that talked about, all right, well, yes, we expect the value, but we can't be short-sighted around making sure that we have the right framework, in this particular case, what we're going to talk about in a second, AI governance capability in place to make sure that we're not incurring technical debt. I call it AI governance debt, which results from having manual processes or trying to duct tape and Band-Aid together when something is so important that you need to have the proper investment, the proper type of capability and program place as part of that. Now, if you go to the next one, what's interesting as we relate to that AI value is that analysts such as Gartner are starting to report on the AI portfolio. We call it AI portfolio intelligence, which is making sure that is understood what is the value, what is the impact that these AI systems are driving, and making sure that we have visibility into not only the projected value around these, so you can evaluate what makes sense and doesn't make sense, but then you can go and track what is the actual value that's being impacted for the business. And you can see on the right-hand side that the APM, Associated for Project Management, talks about how this AI portfolio management, or again, we call it intelligence, is essential. It's critical because you can, as you can imagine, spend too much time on certain areas that aren't necessarily driving the value that is expected, as opposed to putting your emphasis on the areas that are actually driving the either top line or bottom line benefits overall. So this is where it starts, is making sure you have the right visibility in the AI portfolio. But if you go to the next one, in order to unlock that value, AI governance is a key. It's a key enabler to making sure that you can reap that value that you intended. That top left one is a study from PwC where it talks about 46% of executives are differentiating their organization and their products based on using responsible AI. That they recognize that a proper responsible AI program is critical, is paramount in order to unlock that projected value of these AI solutions. And furthermore, analysts on the right-hand side, you can see where Forrester, Gartner, and other analysts are projecting that the actual AI governance software spend is going to grow rapidly, upwards of 30% CAGR from the 2024 to 2030. So there's a recognition from the analysts that these software capabilities that are enabling responsible AI, again, are critical in order to actually achieve the value that you intended overall. Furthermore, if you go to the next one, what we're talking about here is this is a couple of statistics from the Harvard Business Review and from the Explainable AI article on the right-hand side, where it talks about it's not only that we want to make sure we're reaping the value from just tracking perspective, but it talks about how trusted companies outperform their peers by over 400%. So trust is paramount in terms of using AI, having trusted AI that when your customers or consumers of your products and services, that they know that you are using this responsibly and ethically, that you have the right governance procedures in place. That helps to build that trust, which ultimately, as you can see, does have a direct impact on your overall business outcomes. Now, the good news is, if you go to the next one, you say, hey, Dave, this all sounds great. This is fantastic. Let's AI governance. I'm sold, right? It's an enabler. It's going to help us to unlock that value quicker. But this seems like a lot. How do I get started? How do I get going in a way that's not going to take me years to go in and develop something or to implement a software? Well, this is where we developed our minimum viable governance approach, which is to implement the right amount of governance as you mature in your overall AI journey. I call it the Goldilocks of governance. Not too little, but not too much, but just the right amount of governance where you're at in your maturity. Now, this starts with, as we talked about, is that portfolio and inventory, that visibility into everywhere that AI is being used across the organization, and being able to collect that, keep that up to date in a systematic and dynamic way, so that you're not using manual spreadsheets, you're not using emails, right? But just establishing that visibility up front, having the appropriate intake process so that you're verifying not only from a, here's the solution perspective, but from a business perspective. What is this going to be achieving? What are the value drivers in place for this solution? How are we going to actually implement and monitor that that's driving the efficacy that we expected? But then you move into that second area, just a light set of controls. You don't need to go crazy. You need to have just a light set of controls just to make sure that you're protecting the organization. And then ultimately leading into that third area around streamlined reporting, because you want to make sure you're surfacing up to key stakeholders. Hey, here's what we're using. Here's where we're using it. Here's where we're are actually seeing fruits of the overall labor of these AI investments, et cetera. So again, for us, that minimum viable governance is really just easing into it, but still having the right framework in place now so that you don't incur that AI governance debt later, which is very costly to the organization as a whole.
Hey, Dave, just one thing on the controls. There was a question. Maybe you can give a little more details on What are some of those essential controls that need to be in place as part of this approach?
Yeah. So I think I'll just start at the very highest level. And that's first and foremost, making sure that you are having a proper intake in place so that you have a system of record for here's the AI systems. Fundamental, right? The second one is that you are actually doing a risk classification or stratification to say, all right, well, based on what we understand about this, it may involve some sensitive data. This is probably a little bit higher risk to the organization, or it may use, consumer data that may have some ethical fairness concerns that we need to mitigate. So just doing that initial risk stratification. From there, it's just identifying, especially for the high risk ones, what are the couple of checks and balances, if you will, that we need to do to make sure that if it's especially a high risk organization, that we're protecting our the sensitive data, that we're protecting how we do the change management around it, the security around it, et cetera. So again, I'm happy to go into a deeper dive with those that are interested around that area of what are some of the controls that we need to put in place at a minimum. Yeah, great question. If I go to the next one, as part of this, yes, again, MVG is an enabler for the organization, but we also have to keep in mind that regulatory landscape, especially as a reminder, in 2025, this is when the EU AI Act comes into force in terms of the prohibited unacceptable risk enforcement, meaning that any organization that does business in the EU must assure that they are not using any prohibited AI systems overall. That's February of 2025. So just a friendly reminder. Hopefully everybody is well ahead of that. But in general, just something that needs to be taken into account. The high risk ones, as part of Article 6, those will come into force in terms of they are actually have the capability to fine these organizations as early as February of 2026. So prohibited February 2025. Hopefully everybody has their items in a row here, but it's something that they are able to start to fine organizations. And I hope nobody incurs that fine, but please be mindful of that actual date overall. All right, so if we move into, so that was a little bit of look at 2025 as a whole, right? So we talked about 2025 being the year of showing the benefit, showing the value that AI is being driven across the organization, and talk a little bit about, well, you can ease into that, right? With establishing that portfolio intelligence, the intake process as part of that minimum viable governance approach. But one of the things that we just wanted to call out is we oftentimes say, you know what, Dave, we're just too early. We're too early in that in our organizational maturity and our AI maturity. No, you're not. It doesn't matter if you have only a couple of AI use cases. And the main reason is not the regulatory, right? Yes, regulatory is very important. I should make clear that regulatory is very important, right? Managing the risks is very important. But the biggest one that we often find as it relates to the enterprises that we work with is actually the brand and reputational risks, right? So I hate to see this but overall, but if you go to the next one, Jay, where you just want to keep your name out of the papers. I know this is a very sensitive subject, especially within the States around this particular company, but it is a representative example of what can go wrong from a reputational risk perspective if you don't have the right governance, change management, etc. in place, where you expose your brand to, all right, well, they're using AI and in a way that well, they really either shouldn't be, or it seems a little bit risky, but just exposing your brand to those types of AI reputational risks, as we like to call it. Now, not only is it just getting your name in the paper, but as I talked to earlier, and thanks to Giorgio in the chat there, it is about just establishing trust with your customers and consumers, right? So you have these types of brand exposure events, right? You start to lose some of the trust from your customers overall. And, again, as we talked about in that Harvard Business Review article, that without the trust behind a company, you don't generally perform as well as some of your peers. So again, as I mentioned before, it's about not only just making sure that you're managing the internal risk, managing the regulatory risk, but it's also just getting ahead of any, hopefully never happens, but potential brand exposure risks overall. So I went through this quite quickly, but I just wanted to highlight some of what we saw in 2024, what we are with our customer base, with what we're seeing in the market, but also where our customers and the market is going from our perspective in 2025. And I'll turn it back to Jay to wrap up and answer anything else.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, a lot has happened obviously in the last year, and a lot to think about in 2025. But to summarize everything that we went through, 2025 is going to be about showing the money. How do we actually show the return on the investments, show the value for the costs and the effort that has been put into a variety of generative AI use cases and decision-making models overall. And there's a strong need to prepare to manage your AI like a portfolio, so you can easily show that value in what is happening to your executives, to your board, really to your entire enterprise. So a really, really important thing to prepare for going into the next year. The second is, don't wait for an adverse AI event to start your journey with AI governance. Yeah, I've heard a couple folks say AI governance is kind of, it's a climate change type issue, right? Everybody can see it happening, but taking action on it can be, you can wait till tomorrow or keep putting it off. But that adverse action may happen or will happen at some point. So you really want to be ahead of it. Don't wait until it's too late. Don't wait till after the fact. Start taking action today to prepare to protect your business and your reputation. And then lastly, governance is, historically had kind of a big and a heavy weight to it, but that doesn't have to be the case. Dave talked about the minimum viable governance approach, just the right amount of governance so you can continue to, accelerate innovation, move forward with innovation, and just have the right level of governance to scale where you are. So you can start today with this. It's a small effort, but big reward. And it's a process and approach and framework that can scale with you and your business over time. So, take some time to start looking into that approach and putting it into practice in 2025. And with that, that takes us to the end. Thank you all for joining. I know we got about 1 minute left here. And with that time, I'm going to ask you again to please follow ModelOp on LinkedIn if you've enjoyed the insights that we've offered over the past year and will continue to offer into next year. And have a great holiday, and we'll see you all in 2025.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.